Greetings everyone from the once very prominent, still heavily traveled hub that is Interstate Avenue, which is lined with these old great hotels that saw their main heyday more during the middle 20th century. And I did a video specifically focused on these cool old motels that lined this street, many of which are still here. And we just happen to be going to the site of one of those motels today. But it has nothing to do with the motel. It actually has to do with what was there before the motel. Aha, the budget motel. This is what we're looking for, right? Right? No. We're actually looking just past that to the Monticello Motel. So I don't know exactly when this motel was built. I know that the original motel sign dates back to 1953. Now granted, it's been altered over time. So, however long this motel has been here, I know it wasn't here in 1919. And my reason for knowing that is because the home of Edna and Eugene Tuck of Portland, Oregon, was more or less located right there at the edge of the motel. I'll never get that straight. So if you were hoping for a video about a little bit of motel history, my apologies, because this is a story about murder. A new episode of Historic Murders of Portland. So, based on the 1919 address of the Tuck home, it would have been to the north edge of where this motel is today. So it was near the intersection here. This is Interstate and Humboldt. So they lived essentially on the southwest corner of North Interstate and Humboldt. So their house would have been right here, towards the edge of where the Monticello stands today. So it's approximately 5 a.m., May 9th, 1919. The Tuck home, again located generally right here. I'm standing along what would be the north wall of the Monticello. So, generally here-ish. And Edna Tuck, again, her and her husband Eugene lived here. And according to Eugene, he stepped into the bathroom and Edna was left alone in the bedroom of their home here. And all of a sudden, there's a gunshot. Eugene runs into the room, finds his wife Edna laying, flat on the bed, gunshot wound to the chest. So understandably, Eugene calls the police and says, oh my God, like my wife just, committed suicide, shot herself dead on her bed. And authorities rush to the scene to discover the aftermath. So case closed, right? The authorities show up. Edna Tuck is dead. The gun is right there in the bed next to her. The husband's in the other room. He walked away for a second and she was alone and she seized the opportunity to kill herself. It was claimed that Edna Tuck was a very erratic emotionally, and she had threatened to kill herself multiple times. So why would it be a shocker when she finally did it? Well, also, a lot of the claims that she was suicidal came primarily from her husband and a boarder that they had. There was a third person living in their house with them. Well, I mean, they had children, but there was a person who was not a member of the family living in the house. And that was a woman by the name of Marie Middleton. I had to look again. Marie Middleton was about 20 years of age. She'd known the Tuck family for a while, and she had been boarding there, or I guess here, for a while with them. She also kind of defended the idea that Edna Tuck was kind of, pretty emotionally erratic and had threatened to kill herself multiple times. And so her and Eugene were more or less kind of giving the same story, and she also said, well, Eugene went off to the bathroom and she shot herself in bed. But of course, when someone gets shot in a private residence, you have to look into it. And the police sat down with Eugene Tuck, talked it over with him. They sat down with Marie Middleton, and by the time they were done speaking to both of them, the police weren't really buying their story. And so inevitably Eugene Tuck was arrested for the first-degree murder of his wife. And now the Tucks were, it was a very interesting home that they had, that they were living in, that Marie was renting the upstairs from. By the description in the newspaper, it was kind of this ransacked house that had cracks, there were holes in the wall, there was just like sparse carpeting, but there wasn't really carpeting everywhere. And it was just kind of generally like just a rundown home that they were living in. And the husbands, the head of the household, they always get crap when their house is kind of ransacked and it just kind of looks just beat up, and it's like, why would you allow your family to live in squalor like this? But what was interesting was, while their home right over here was kind of beat up, it was just kind of a little hole in the wall, and apparently they had money but were kind of struggling, was inside the house they had all these expensive instruments. They had like two really nice pianos. They had some not percussion, and not woodwind instruments, but like horns and things like that. Like, it's like Eugene Tuck spent a bunch of their money on these really expensive instruments, because I guess he was a musician of sorts, and meanwhile allowed his family to kind of live in squalor over here. And so you think, like, this guy, whether he shot his wife or not, this guy's kind of a piece of crap. He's allowing his family to suffer and, not live in the best of conditions because he wants, this and that. I mean, I kind of understand that. I kind of grew up with that a little bit myself. And what's so interesting about that is you think, like, okay, Eugene Tuck is, kind of, again, whether he murdered his wife or not, this guy's kind of a scumbag. A little bit. There's not really a lot of charm to him. But for whatever reason, him and Marie Middleton had been fooling around with each other. So when you've got an affair going on and the wife turns up dead, and the closest witnesses you have are the husband and the boarder who's been sleeping with the husband, that's gonna raise a little bit of conflict. You're gonna start wondering, do we really know what happened? Was this just a simple suicide, as we've been led to believe? Especially in, this is 1919, and affairs were much less received. I mean, people don't love affairs these days, but back then, you could get ostracized for that kind of thing. So I definitely think when that came out, they searched, they looked around the home in the aftermath of Edna's death, and they discovered one of Eugene's like undershirts upstairs in Marie's room. And, it wasn't like Marie had just moved in the day before and maybe some of their stuff was left up there. She'd been living there for a while at this point. There was really no reason for, underclothing from Eugene to be up in her room unless there was something going on. And they also found they said it was a band that a blacksmith would use, and Eugene Tuck worked as a blacksmith. So you're finding these items of his, and of course he quickly says, "No, I was never in her room. What kind of man do you think I am?" And that didn't work out so great, because Marie Middleton, maybe because she didn't realize the full scope of things and maybe felt there wasn't anything to be ashamed of, she was like, "No, he's come up to my room." She didn't admit that they were sleeping together, but she said, "Yeah, he's come up to my room." At which time, when that came out, he was like, "Okay, fine. I admit I went up to her room at some time or another." But he actually admitted to going up to her room at about 3 a.m. that morning, so about 2 hours before Edna winds up dead. And we don't know exactly what he was doing up there, but by his claim, he said he only went upstairs into her room to get cough medicine. I don't know, maybe she had there was like an off extra bathroom up there. You'd wonder why he'd be keeping their cough medicine up there in her room. But actually, as you'll see much later in this video, it actually does kind of make sense that he would be trying to look for something like cough medicine or a medicine to help with an ailment, but we'll get to that later. So pretty quickly, the focus is moving in on the husband. And of course, the general idea is, maybe he killed his wife so that he could, have this nice younger woman to be with. It wouldn't be the first time that something like that has happened. And to kind of add to that and really not help the situation at all for Eugene Tuck is neighbors saw him and Marie Middleton the evening before the murder, and they said that they saw the two walking joyously hand in hand through the neighborhood. So, he couldn't even make the claim like, "Oh, that maybe this happened, we fooled around a couple years ago, but nothing's happened since." They couldn't make that claim because they were seen only hours before Edna supposedly commits suicide, and they're obviously being romantic with each other, so this affair was obviously still going on. Now, does that make him more guilty, or does it possibly make, what if Edna's already kind of unhinged, and then she hears about that or sees them walking outside hand in hand, and that triggers off something, and maybe that's more of a reason to believe she killed herself? That alone, it's hard to say. However, there were other things that made it seem like this was probably not a suicide but a murder. Now, the weapon in question, the one that Edna Tuck supposedly used to kill herself, was an Iver Johnson pistol, which, with a little piece of extra history, the gun that was supposedly used to kill Robert Kennedy in 1968 was an Iver Johnson. But there's a lot of questionable elements to that, and that is a story for another day. But I primarily recognized Iver Johnson because I've heard that word thrown around in relation to the Robert Kennedy assassination. My personal hero. So it was found out that the gun in question had been borrowed about 6 months earlier by Eugene Tuck from a friend of his named Ralph Mitchell. Mitchell said that Tuck told him he needed the gun simply for protection. Didn't really seem to elaborate much on that. So, it doesn't seem like he obtained the gun with the express purpose of killing his wife if he got it and then waited 6 months. Maybe he was planning on it and kept stopping himself. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know. But the problem is Eugene Tuck denied knowing where the pistol that was used came from, when it was obvious that he had borrowed it from a friend, and that friend was more than cooperative to say, "Yeah, no, he came and borrowed this from me." And Mitchell lived a little ways south, not too far, but on the fringe of the small part of the old Albino neighborhood that still exists. He lived on Borthwick between Russell and Knott streets. So Eugene lied initially about fooling around with Marie Middleton. He lied about knowing where this gun came from. If he's completely innocent, these are things that, why are you lying about these things? I understand, like, it may make things look a little suspicious if you say, yeah, I'm the one that got that gun. But still, you can make the argument my wife was kind of crazy and suicidal. I was in the other room. Marie Middleton claims that he was in the bathroom, even though well, I'll get to that. My questioning, because Marie Middleton pretty much just defended everything Eugene Tuck said on the matter. But considering what they were doing together, she had reason to do that. And what's also a further interest in relation to the firearm itself is, the idea is Edna is sitting there, she shoots herself in the chest, puts the gun right up to her chest, shoots herself, and then just, falls back on the bed. That makes sense. However, the gun in question was found underneath a pillow on the bed. So that's bizarre enough. How does she get the gun to go under a pillow? And, it goes under a pillow that's right next to her. Like, the gun just kind of lands, like, right here at her side. Now, I'm not a, gun expert by any means, but I have seen expert after expert, not just gun experts, but people who have, had to deal with some grisly crimes, crimes wherein they had to show up in the aftermath of a suicides by gunshot. And pretty much their standard, with very few exceptions, is, when you put a gun, especially if you put just a gun to your head or a gun to your chest, it shoots you back and you recoil and you kind of throw the gun forward usually. It's almost never happens that someone who commits suicide, when they shoot themselves, unless it's like with a shotgun and they have it angled up and like it's anchored in place. But if you just got a handgun, it'll shoot you back, but it'll recoil backwards, and usually they'll end up throwing the gun. Little guns like that are practically never found still in the hand or in the immediate, like right next to the victim, unless there's something that makes it happen that way. So we have a gun that lands under a pillow somehow, and it lands right next to her. It doesn't like bounce across the bed or hit a wall next to her. It just kind of lands right next to her, which doesn't make sense under those circumstances. If you shoot yourself like this, you should go backwards and the gun should you go forward and the gun kind of flies off in front of you. That didn't fit. So that's another issue in this situation, is that this was not looking like a suicide, or at least the aftermath of a suicide. And here's another thing, and this may be a smaller detail, but while the gun landed really close to Edna Tuck, it also landed, if her hand lands like this, it landed with the grip and the trigger area facing away from her. So it was facing that way when it should have been facing in towards her hand. So it was like when she dropped the gun, she would have had to have literally gone or I guess out and around. She would have had to do something with her hand that she couldn't have possibly done. And so even when again, is that kind of a moot point, because the gun is found under a pillow. So I mean, that in and of itself, but again, those two things suggest that somebody took the gun afterwards and slid it under that pillow. It's the only way you explain how it ends up under a pillow, and maybe they weren't paying attention. They ended up having the grip facing away from her instead of towards her. So even if she did commit suicide, it looks like somebody came in and messed with the scene afterwards. Now, obviously, the only person that would have done that would have been Eugene Tuck. Now, why would he go in the aftermath of a suicide and mess with the crime scene and risk the police noticing these particular things that they noticed? So he's brought in on a first-degree murder charge. Marie Middleton is brought in on a second-degree murder charge. They figured, again, they were having an affair, so the police probably figured she was at least indirectly involved in all of this. And even with the complications and kind of these oddities with the way the crime scene was, the finally admitted affair that Eugene Tuck and Marie Middleton were having, you know, what further didn't help Eugene Tuck's cause was in the immediate aftermath of his wife's, you know, suicide, he kind of seemed kind of unmoved by what was happening. He didn't seem bothered by the fact that his wife supposedly had just killed herself. That always, you know, that's always a red flag. I've covered so many cases where people were thought, boom, that person's definitely the killer, because they're having like no emotional reaction to this. How could you not? I mean, we know now today that people react to different things differently, but when a husband has generally an unconcerned and kind of calm and general reaction to things, that's cause for concern. You know, if I walked in on the love of my life after having just committed suicide, I'd be utterly inconsolable. And you think most people would, at least to a degree, be inconsolable. But, you know, the Tucks, it doesn't seem like they had a horrible marriage. They didn't have a perfect marriage by any means. Marie Middleton's attitude was, well, Edna Tuck was so far gone that her husband mostly just stayed with her out of pity, or felt like, oh, well, you know, if he ever, you know, tries to leave her, well, she'll probably try to kill herself, you know. So that was kind of Marie Middleton's attitude, was that, you know, he really didn't want to be with her anymore, but he kind of stuck with her. And, you know, they did have kids together. So there were reasons for him to stay around, but they had a few domestic issues. And just a year earlier, they'd actually had the police called to their home on a, you know, domestic type situation. So their marriage was by no means perfect, but it wasn't, you know, this kind of horrid, tumultuous marriage that a lot of, you know, couples had experienced that may or may not have ended in gunshots, so to speak. So May 12th comes around. It's about 3 days after the murder, or suicide, and, you know, they give Eugene and Marie the opportunity to explain themselves a bit, explain, you know, further what went on. You know, were you really where you say you were? You know, how do we show that you weren't responsible so that we don't, you know, try to indict you on this? And they refused to speak, which is kind of, it didn't even seem like it was on advice of like lawyers. Like, they just didn't speak. They just kept their mouths shut. So in that vein, it can be a little bit suspicious. Now, they may have figured if they talked, they might have said something they didn't mean to say and gotten in trouble for, you know, saying something that wasn't fully accurate. That's possible. But in those circumstances, it didn't really help them, at least in terms of, you know, the police looking into this as, you know, a possible murder case. And they did note, it was reported in newspapers that both Eugene and Marie looked kind of uneasy during the proceedings. Eugene Tuck looked particularly uneasy during these proceedings. And as it turned out, he actually was sick during this time. And fast forward about a day and a half, it's 9 a.m., May 14th, 1919, Eugene Tuck is discovered in his jail cell that he's been staying in, and he's like tweaking and convulsing, and they don't know what's happening, and they try to address the situation, but Eugene Tuck ended up dying almost immediately after he was discovered. And it was found that he died of lobar pneumonia, which apparently he'd been suffering for several days. Like, he apparently had this before his wife even died. So he was just having this really bad case of pneumonia and going out for walks with Marie and being kind of, you know, left in this jail cell. And it actually, in the aftermath, sparked this major backlash because people got pissed that this guy had been kept in a jail cell for some 3 or 4 days, and he was suffering from pneumonia the whole time, and they were just letting him stay sick and in these, you know, not exactly ideal conditions, being in a jail cell. And essentially lobar pneumonia, there's like this accumulation and this like congealing of this cellular debris. I mean, it's very You know, I really don't fully understand exactly what it is, but it you know, consolidates and hardens like in the lung, the lobe of the lungs, and I guess it can be this very, very rough thing to experience, whether you survive it or not. And Eugene Tuck was just living with it and dealing with it. And again, when I was discussing earlier, his claim that the only reason he went up to Marie's room a couple hours before Edna Tuck died was because he went to get some cough medicine. And it's like, well, he actually probably, you know, he was sick with pneumonia at the time. There would have actually been a reason for him to be going and getting something like that. So, I mean, it doesn't change. I mean, he obviously was still having an affair with Marie Middleton. And, but this threw everything on its face because, you know, I don't think anybody really thought Marie was the killer. I think they were working with the theory that Eugene was the killer. Maybe she knew that he was planning on doing this. Maybe she was going to be, you know, an accomplice, at least to the point that she knew it was going to happen and she wasn't going to do anything to stop it, and she wasn't going to, you know, if they asked her questions, she wasn't going to throw Eugene under the bus. But they didn't really think Marie was actually a killer. They thought if this isn't a suicide, Eugene Tuck, the husband, is the one responsible. And all of a sudden, about 4.5 days, well, no, actually, it would have been a little more than 5 days after Edna Tuck dies, her husband, the primary murder suspect, is himself now dead and can no longer be questioned. He cannot be indicted. There's nothing to go on, because even if they determined with absolute certainty that this guy was the killer, they can't do anything about it. What are they going to put him in heaven jail? Like, so when he died, the case pretty much died with it. That being said, you know, Marie Middleton was still alive, but essentially she was let go right after, because she was really only being kept primarily because Eugene Tuck was being kept. He's now dead. They figured, well, whatever, let's set her free. And, you know, Marie Middleton had been living with them for a while. She'd separated from her husband, Earl, a couple months earlier, about 3 months earlier, and Earl Middleton, the, you know, husband, he fully blamed Eugene Tuck for the breakup of their marriage, and that's why she was living with the Tucks. She'd actually known them for a couple of years, and the idea was they met, she got a little cozy with Eugene, and things started going south in her own marriage. But of course, when she separated from her husband and needed somewhere to go, she conveniently had a place to go to. Why not go stay at the home of the guy that you've been fooling around with in the past? And that's why she was there. But even after Eugene died, and obviously, you know, Marie had at least some feelings for this guy. She'd been fooling around with him for a very long time. So of course, her attitude was, you know, she's the only one still alive in this whole dynamic anymore, and she was going to defend Eugene Tuck to the very end. And here's my thing with Marie Middleton, and I'll get more into this, is I really don't, I know it's around 1920, and people want to act like women weren't capable of horrible things because they're so perfect and dainty and, you know, diminutive and all this other stuff. I really don't know why Marie Middleton wasn't more considered as the killer here. Maybe Eugene did it, but, you know, here's Marie. She's thrown away her whole marriage pretty much with this guy, and even her own ex-husband has blamed Earl, like Earl Tuck is the reason this happened. It seems like she had pretty strong feelings for Eugene, even though Eugene, I think Eugene was like around, he may have only been in his early 30s. I want to say he was around 40, so he was almost like twice Marie's age. But hey, you know, whatever, we're into what we're into, I guess. So, you know, it seems like, you know, and again, if they're seen walking around hand in hand, it seems like Marie was pretty serious about this thing. And the one thing that's in her way is crazy Edna, who, you know, again, Marie Middleton said, oh, she was wacko, she was nuts, she threatened to kill herself like 423 times, and then she finally just did it, you know. It was obvious that I don't think she cared much for Edna, and obviously was very enamored of Eugene. And after Eugene died, she said definitively he was not the killer. He was in another room, the bathroom specifically. That's where Eugene says he was. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, because when they asked her to elaborate, well, how do you know? What is your eyewitness account that definitively shows that Eugene wasn't in the room with Edna when it happened? And she refused to elaborate. And I'm like, well, what? Okay, the only way, aside from saying like, well, I just know he would never do anything like that, the only way you know he didn't do it is if you're in the room with Edna when she shoots herself and you see her do it, or you're in the bathroom with Eugene and it's obvious you two are here and Edna's over there, so you know he wasn't there to shoot her. One of the two. Now, if it's 5 a.m., my understanding is, and most likely, Marie Middleton would be upstairs asleep in bed. Logistically. You know, she never said where she was and she wouldn't elaborate. Why wouldn't she elaborate on that if she's so dead set on defending Eugene? Could it be because she was the killer and, you know, maybe didn't want to mix her words up? Dang. I don't know, but she doesn't give a reason for why she's so dead certain. She says he wasn't there, but she doesn't say she's with him. That doesn't jibe with me. That's not enough. And, you know, she was the only person still alive, so she was the only one that could keep talking. So, you know, she could easily be affected by her agenda on the matter, and that is that she's going to side with Eugene over Edna every time. She could have literally watched him shoot her dead with her own two eyes, and she would say Eugene didn't do it, it was a suicide, because she would have an agenda to defend him. And now he turns up dead in the aftermath, so now Marie's probably even more bitter, you know, especially if she was responsible for killing Edna. Now, a couple days later, it's like, maybe we can get out of this. And, you know, maybe in the end they'll decide that Edna killed herself, and I, Marie, and Eugene can go off and actually, like, you know, live and have some kind of existence with each other, finally, together in the aftermath. You know, to hell with the fact that the Tucks also had 2 children. Marie probably didn't care about that. I guess she would just be the crude stepmother in that dynamic, but yeah, you know, so she was probably, you know, even more bitter. Now suddenly Eugene's also gone. Which is just so, that dynamic of it is so crazy. I don't think I've stumbled onto a case like that where the suspect, I mean, aside from a suicide, where the suspect dies in a way that is just, you know, it just happened. It was an illness. But, yeah, I really don't know why Marie Middleton wasn't more seriously considered as a suspect in all this. She could have waited till Eugene was out of the room, wasn't there. She steps up, sneaks up on Edna, shoots her in the chest, slides the gun, you know, under the pillow. Oh, just put it over here, it'll be fine. Leaves the room real quick. Eugene comes in. You know, maybe Eugene finds her doing it, but they decide, you know, we're not going to tell anybody that. Or he comes into the room and genuinely discovers his wife dead and thinks, oh my God, she shot herself. Wouldn't that be a crazy situation? It could be that even going into death in that dynamic, Eugene Tuck may have literally genuinely thought his wife killed herself when it was Marie Middleton all along. Who's to say for certain, but I can't reconcile the crime scene and the fact that the gun managed to be under a pillow. It was way too close to the body of someone that would have been shooting themselves like this. And, you know, a smaller detail to me, but the gun butt was facing the wrong direction. Nothing fit. This looked like a murder that was very poorly staged to maybe look like a suicide. I can't really reconcile that. So while, you know, Eugene Tuck went to the grave without any real, you know, further scrutiny, and Marie Middleton was just released at the drop of a hat, you know, whatever the circumstances are, I really don't think Edna Tuck killed herself. She may have made threats in the past, but that doesn't automatically mean that when someone finally turns up dead from a gunshot, that they kill themselves. In fact, people can use that to their advantage. You know, I'm going to kill this person, and they've threatened to kill themselves numerous times, so if I make it look like a suicide, everyone's going to believe it. I really think Edna Tuck was murdered, and that train agrees with me. And if Edna Tuck was murdered, she was either murdered by her husband Eugene or Marie Middleton. And while I was taking notes on this, I was thinking, yeah, Eugene Tuck probably killed his wife, got fed up with her, wanted to run off with Marie, whatever But the more I thought about it, even in the course of just going through this and talking about it and thinking about it as I'm talking, I come away thinking Marie Middleton was the killer more than Eugene. I can't prove it, but again, if I think it's a murder case, it's one of those two. And I just think, in that moment and in the aftermath, Marie Middleton seemed a lot more vindictive than Eugene on the matter. Sure, Eugene seemed unbothered by his wife's death, which might be a sign that he killed her and didn't care. But I come away from this feeling like Marie Middleton was more likely to have been responsible, all things considered. But literally the day after Eugene Tuck died, they released her, They were pretty much keeping her just on the grounds of their case against Eugene. And with him gone, they honestly felt they couldn't really pursue the case any further. So they just let her go, and the case faded away, into nothingness. By the time the next month came by, this case was just gone. Who cares? The suspect's gone. I think Marie Middleton did it. That's my conclusion. That's my hot take on the murder. I don't think it was a suicide of Edna Tuck in 1919 at the hands of her husband or that border of theirs. And you know where I lean. So anyway, that is the full story as far as I've been able to gather information on it, at least. And as always, I thank you guys so much for stopping by. Hope you're enjoying the series as I continue it. Thank you for supporting the series, for supporting the channel, for supporting me. All of the above. And all that said, till next time, remember to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon, links in the description. And this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian, with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland.